Let's continue with the cardiovascular system and look a bit at arteries and veins. Now think about some of the functions of arteries and veins in the body. There's like a big pipeline system to move things around the body. You got to bring countless numbers of different types of nutrients into all the tissues with the living cells, and at the same time you got to get the waste material out. And actually things that increase blood flow to tissues is actually more a buildup of the waste products than what it is, say, a decrease in good things like the nutrients. So you got to transport countless things around the body. You'll see more of those in different chapters. Moving nutrients. You can think of nutrients as anything a cell needs, anything as simple as water, sugar, ions, proteins, amino acids, whatever that may be. Got to get the waste products out. They will build up and they will kill cells in all tissues. You got to move gases. You always hear about a discussion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Those will be looked at more in other chapters. Hormones is something else that have to be moved around by the blood because by definition, a hormone is a chemical signal that enters the blood and travels some distance to a target tissue. Look at number 3, regulating blood pressure. A lot of people don't realize that your blood vessels can do this. Anytime blood vessels constrict, that's when the muscle in the middle layer, we'll look at these tunics in a minute, constricts and gets smaller. The pipe gets smaller in diameter, radius, however you want to look at it. And when the blood vessels get smaller, pressure rises. Think about if you put your hand around your wrist and you constrict, in other words, squeeze, you feel more pressure. If that muscle in the walls of the blood vessels relaxes, in other words, the blood vessel dilates and opens up, you're going to get less pressure. So by constricting and dilating the muscle in the walls of blood vessels, you can definitely change blood pressure. Number 4, regulating blood flow. You're not always having the same amount of blood going to different tissues at different times. Depends on what you're doing. You think about when you're sitting and resting, there'll be a whole lot less blood going to things like heart, lungs, and skeletal muscle. But when you do get active, the blood vessels into those areas would dilate and send a whole lot more into them. There's a big change in blood flow. As tissues get more active, they'll get more blood flow. When they get less active, they'll get less. And remember, when you look at arteries and veins, the primary way that you define them is by the direction of the blood flow going through them. Arteries will always take blood away from the heart and to the tissues, and veins will always do exactly the opposite. Take that blood out of the tissues and right back towards the heart. Look at these different types of blood vessels you find in the body. Now, starting at the heart, the very first arteries you're going to see are the very large elastic arteries. They are largest in diameter, and they are highly elastic. Large amount of elastic fibers that helps to stabilize your blood pressure. And also the large amount of elastic fibers gives these walls strength. And since these arteries here are closest to the ventricles, they're going to need a whole lot of this inside of them. So if you look at, say, that left ventricle of the heart, that chamber generates around 2,000 millimeters mercury pressure when it's constricting. You push that blood into these arteries right there close to it, like the aorta, they better have strong walls. So they're largest in diameter, closest to the heart, under the most pressure, and have the thickest walls. Now, as you move away from the heart, you don't have to go very far, and you're going to start to change into the medium-sized muscular arteries. Here's where a lot of blood flow is diverted, say more or less to an area of the body, depending on what's happening at the moment. So as you move away from the heart, they may lose just a little bit of that elastic tissue, not much, but they're going to pick up a whole lot more of that smooth muscle in that middle layer of their wall. It's going to let them constrict and dilate to regulate blood flow. Once you get away from these medium arteries, you're going to eventually run down into arterioles. These will be the last arteries seen before capillaries. So these are the last arteries that still have all 3 of the layers or tunics in their wall. You get past them, you run into the capillary. There's nothing left of the tunics, just a simple squamous epithelial layer. And that's what the endothelium is. This inner layer of epithelial cells that lines the inside of every blood vessel, just a simple squamous layer, one flat layer of cells. And since that is as thin as it gets in the human body, the capillaries are where almost all materials enter and leave the blood. Again, with a thick wall, you wouldn't see much of anything passing through that, but with this very thin one, you will. Now you've gone away from the heart into the capillaries. The arteries started off very large in diameter and got smaller as you went towards the capillaries. Now on your way back, the veins are the opposite. They start off very small in diameter and they get larger on the way back. So right after a capillary, first vein you're going to encounter will be a venule. So these are found right after the capillaries. After that, you'll just move into what's called small veins, medium, and then large veins like the vena cava, which lead back to the right side of the heart. But looking back at those capillaries, that simple squamous endothelial layer is very important. You didn't have that very thin layer, not much would be able to get in and out of the blood of a tissue. So it's very important. All these blood vessels have that simple squamous layer to the inside. But when you get to the endothelium layer at the capillary, that's all that's left. There's nothing else around it. When you look at the diameter of a capillary, notice how they're about 7 to 10 microns in diameter. And that size is important because notice that a red blood cell is only about 7.5 microns. So that shows you that these red blood cells have to go through these capillaries single file, one after another. And if these reds didn't have that biconcave shape that made them very flexible, they'd probably get clogged up in these tiny pipes and blood flow would stop. Let's also look just a second at substances which do and do not move easily through the wall of a capillary. Now, to think about why this is, think back to the cell membrane. Think about what a cell membrane is made up of. Pretty much two things, lipids and proteins. There's a small amount of carbs, but not much. So since a large amount of that cell wall is made up of lipids, lipids and lipids will mix, and lipid-soluble materials will pass through these walls quite easily just by simple diffusion. Again, since lipid and lipid will mix, they tend to pass through. But everybody knows oil and water doesn't mix. You take a water-soluble molecule, that's not going to mix with that lipid layer, and it's not going to pass through. It may get through some tiny little spot that's extremely small, might be taken into the cell by endocytosis, but it will not easily diffuse through that cell wall at all. Large molecules are not going to pass easily through this layer. They might be able to get through these tiny spaces called fenestra that we'll see here in a second, but the large ones aren't going to pass through easily, the small ones a whole lot more. Look also at these different types of capillaries you see in the body. Now, most all capillaries in the body are what's called the continuous type, meaning that these simple squamous epithelial cells that make up that endothelial capillary wall, they're joined end to end. So in other words, you don't have any spaces in between those squamous cells. And even though these are the least porous of all our capillaries, they still let a lot of materials move through them, especially the small lipid soluble. But all the nutrients will pass out of the blood and into the tissues. And of course, the waste products will move back out of the tissue and into the blood. Muscle and nervous systems, wherever you find a lot of these. Fenestrated capillaries are another type. Fenestra means window in Latin, and what you'll find in a fenestrated capillary network are very, very tiny spaces in between these endothelial cells, so small that even large molecules can't pass through them. So it takes something very tiny to get through this. Here are some examples of where you'll see them, but when we get to the kidneys, you're going to see these glomeruli. It's these capillaries in the kidneys have these fenestra in between the cells. Then you see sinusoidal. Now, these are similar to the fenestra, but the gaps are larger. Large molecules can get through these. They're still really tiny, but they're getting more porous. And then with the last one, the sinusoid, the spaces are so big in between the cells that entire cells can fit between them. Think about a place like the red bone marrow, right? How in the world do the cells made there ever get into these pipes we call arteries and veins? Well, the walls of the capillaries have such big gaps that the cells can fit in between them and get into the cardiovascular system. So here's a picture showing a lot of these major arteries and veins around the body. We'll talk more about those on some other videos. Good little picture right here showing the arterial and venous circulation. Here's the heart. Again, there's the right and left side of the heart, two different pumps as we mentioned before. Good picture down here showing the blood flow through the heart, which we saw in another video too.